Welcome to the City Report Card with Bob Bernstein and Ashley Northington. The City Report is a Zoomcast where we explore Nashville through a different perspective aside from it being Music City, It City, or any kind of city except for the one we've lived in for a long time and seen change dramatically, and not always for all of the people or for the better. We decided to do this show after serving 3 years on the Chamber's Education Report Committee, where we learned a whole lot about how the public school district works, how it's funded, and what challenges it faces. After all of the interviews, readings, and discussions, our biggest takeaway is that we can't judge the public school district without first judging ourselves. That means we can't point fingers at public schools without taking a deeper look at all of the other systems and institutions that connect to it. And that's everything from affordable housing to the private industry, to transit and mobility, to the nonprofit sector. This is why we're hosting this series of conversations to explore those connections and the relationships in hopes that we can make a difference. So, who are we? Well, I'm Ashley Northington, and I am what Nashvillians call a unicorn. That means I'm actually from here. In fact, I'm a fourth generation Nashville native, and my passion for education stems from the amazing experiences I had having attended eight, yes, eight, Nashville public schools. I'm a graduate of Antioch High School, a former education reporter, state education department official, education policy analyst, and now I get to work with educational institutions across the country, helping them navigate their challenges and better connect with their audience. I do this work because I know the tremendous value education made in my life, and I want to make sure that more students have a great experience.
And I'm Bob Bernstein. I'm also a former journalist who didn't go to eight elementary schools, but I did go to 4 colleges, so I got you there. I moved here in 1988 from suburban Chicago to write about tax and government. I soon pivoted and became a restaurant entrepreneur, opening such places as Bongo Java and Fido. I've served as a founding board member of Hands On Nashville and Nashville Prep, and was board member of a Bintry Montessori school. And in addition to the report card committee you talked about, I am now part of the Leadership Public Education. And I'm darn excited to be part of the second class of that program. My interest in education issues came from a feeling that my formal education failed me. My wife, Irma, and I wanted something different for education for our 2 sons, and thus enrolled them in a Bintry Montessori. My eldest finished there last year and is now a freshman at Hume Fogg. And today I'm going to have you introduce our special guest, Ashley.
So today we are super excited because we're joined by Christiane Buggs, who serves as chairwoman of the Board of Education for Metro Nashville Public Schools. Christiane represents District 5, and she holds a bachelor's degree in physics and 2 master's degrees, one in education from Tennessee State University, and the other one in urban education from Vanderbilt University. Both of these master's degrees come with education research experience. Her teaching and civil service spans the gamut of Nashville's public education system. She has taught at a Nashville charter school and a traditional public school. She's also served as a volunteer tutor with the Metro Nashville Public Schools Reading Clinic, and has served as a middle school girls track, basketball, and cheerleading coach. Christiane is also a unicorn. She's a Nashville native and a proud product of Metro Nashville Public Schools. As a student, teacher, and community member, she's experienced our school system in a variety of ways. Her full-time job keeps her heavily involved in the school system, and currently she serves as the manager of literacy partnerships for the United Way. Welcome, Christiane.
Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction.
Good. So we're going to go ahead and just jump into it. I'm so glad that you're here, but we know that we are facing unprecedented times in lots of ways. Most of it brought on by the pandemic that we are all living through. I want you to share with us, how do you think the pandemic has affected Metro Nashville Public Schools, and how do you think the pandemic has pushed people to sort of advocate or support advocate for support or resources for our schools?
Goodness, such a loaded question. So I'm just gonna give you all of my thoughts, if you don't mind, or at least the ones that bubble up bubble up the highest. So first is the idea that Metro Nashville Public Schools is like every other public education system in America in that it was not built to serve the diverse needs of students. It wasn't built to support students who didn't have a strong foundational a background. Their parents may not have gone to school or may have had ill experiences with education. It wasn't built to support poor students. It wasn't built to support students who speak different languages or of different ethnicities. So the pandemic happening and sending us to our homes where learning does start for parents, but may not translate the same across neighborhoods or across homes. That's where we saw the biggest impact. We saw that the resources students had at home determined how much learning loss they experienced. Little things like highlighters and crayons that as an educator, as the parent of a toddler, I have on hand at any given time. Many families just didn't. They just have never had the resources for that extra funding. They didn't have people around them who had home libraries. I mean, kids couldn't get their hands on books. And this is something that in the education sector, we knew all along, but having everyone in their homes kind of it kept us from turning a blind eye to it. And I still say that more than the pandemic and the safer at home mandates, the experience and the long-term impact that the killing of George Floyd had on America definitely translated to a shift in how we view education, because finally we were forced to talk about inequities, stereotypes, the way that differently abled children, Black children, poor children, just so anyone that was different than a white Christian person in America, how their experience is just different and typically under-resourced and stereotyped. It forced us to see all of that and try to have to deal with it. And I think once as a teacher, I've tried to shout from the mountaintops that our students didn't have what they needed to survive. Not just to thrive, not to live, but literally to survive. If we want them to be professional, confident adults, if we want them to be well-learned and cultured and be able to articulate their feelings and thoughts, we had not been preparing them equitably. And again, there are just so many different things I could say and so many different thoughts I have, but at the very least, it made us see those inequities, and it made parents realize that what they assumed happened behind four walls of a school building and during an 8-hour day was much different than they remembered or that they experienced as children themselves, that there was a lot of social emotional learning that took place. There were a lot of almost inquantifiable experiences that our students were going through during the day, and they no longer had access to that. So one of the more negative impacts that I think it's had is that it's forced our more affluent neighbors who had not been really used to being uncomfortable. It forced them to advocate, but unfortunately, they were advocating in a way that from a limited perspective. So a lot of the phone calls and the emails that we get are that, affluent parents feel like they can cover their students' needs. They can pay for extra resources. They can have live-in nannies if they so need to, but they were assuming that the experience of Black, brown, poor, or differently abled children would be just so much that they were in a deficit, that they needed to be in person, just like my affluent student needs to be in person, where we're seeing in communities of color and communities that are poor, that families are feeling much more comfortable keeping their children at home, not just because it's safer for them, but because they're not having those negative experiences they once were having, like getting suspended disproportionately or inappropriately in contradiction to a handbook. They weren't being made to feel like expectations were limited to them. True, their resources might have been limited, but expectations are not limited at home. It was just, we forget, or more affluent parents tend to forget that the class setup is not the same in affluent neighborhoods or affluent schools as it is in poorest neighborhoods and schools. So we're already understaffed in some of our under-resourced schools. So sending them back in person just made for larger class sizes, made for more widespread quarantine, made for more disruption in the school day because students would have to go from in-person to quarantining and then, in the virtual space and then back to in-person. So I think it's in a lot of ways helped in that it shone a light on what we needed it to shine a light on, right? It showed inequity, but it's been a bit to our detriment because those who have a voice and have had the capacity and the knowledge and the savvy to advocate are advocating, but almost to the detriment of the students they claim to be advocating for. So I'll stop there so I won't keep rambling.
No. You're kind of hitting on all the stuff that I wanted to bring up to you, because I had a couple quotes of yours that were just about that. I was going to throw back at you, but you kind of did,
Well.
kind of just basically said it. I think if I could have your speech that you made at the unveiling of the education report this last week or so, I think I would just plug that in here right now. But that was great.
Thank you.
But one thing I did read, you said, and I thought this was interesting, is one thing the pandemic has done is highlighted the long known inequities in MNPS and with public education itself, and brought it to the need to do something stage of all parts of our city. And in our perspective of talking about the whole city, which you talked about at the report unveiling, that's what we're talking about. So how would you explain what we're trying to say and what you said really well the other day?
Oh goodness, if I could only get back in the zone and remember. But so I would say first that education or the public education system really is a behemoth. And sometimes we tend to get overwhelmed and say, well, it's been like that for decades. We won't ever be able to change it. It's a system. How do you change systems and culture and historic biases? How do we change hearts and minds? How do we change dollars? So first, I would say that's my first call to action. Don't get overwhelmed. Before we press record on this Zoomcast, we were talking about everyone just doing their job. Everyone has a role. Everyone has something they can do. And if everyone just does a little bit, we'll be so much further ahead than we are right now. So I would say the everyday person can just kind of get to know the school system around them. They can get to know the neighborhood school. And by neighborhood school, I do mean that loosely. Just get to know a school that's in your area, in your neighborhood. Try to see if you can make a connection with them. It could be that they just need you as a body, or for now as a voice. You'd be surprised at how often we just need time for some of our students who need to read a little bit longer, have a few questions that are very basic that any adult would be able to talk them through. They just need some time one-on-one or in small groups, and we just don't have the capacity. So maybe it's your body or your voice. It could always be your resources, like your time, talent, and treasure. So it could be you donating a sum of money. It could also be you donating a partnership of some kind. If you're a small business owner, if you work for a corporation, or if you're a stay-at-home parent, there is still something that you can offer to a young person. So I would say just make a connection in some way. I'm going to always stress, because I have a toddler myself that I'm going to enroll. Hopefully he gets into the 3-year-old pre-K in MNPS. I'm just trying to galvanize other young parents to consider doing the same. Consider looking at the schools that are around you. And if you're not putting your child in those schools, see if you can become a part of the thread of that school. See if you can become a part of the PTO. Don't let that parent-teacher organization, don't let the name confuse you or make you feel like you can't be part of it, because you can. We're always looking for community partners. But I think even beyond all of those things, even, beyond the kind of platter of options that I gave you, just talking in a positive light about public education helps, because the more we say, oh, there's that public education, whenever someone, with a negative connotation, whenever someone does something we don't agree with, stop doing that. When you hear on the nightly news or on the radio or from a friend that something is happening in the school system that you don't like or that you don't think is to the benefit of kids, I'd ask that you do research before you hop on that bandwagon and want to be dismissive of the students and the hard work and the teachers and all that they do to love on students and partner with parents. And I think it can just be, we belittle public education so much that we no longer have high expectations for them. And with low expectations comes low resourcing. If we tend to fight. We tend to say to defund something if we don't like it, but children should be just in a different bucket. They're not a business. Schools are not functions that we need to fix. Schools are something that we need to resource. And so when we talk about defunding schools because they're not doing what we think they should do, they're not meeting the needs of students in the way that we should, that is so counterproductive. We need to always be advocating for more funding for schools. I don't care how much you think they are mismanaging. They're not. I can almost promise you that across Tennessee, at the very least, we don't have enough money to mismanage a dime. We just don't. Our almost $1 billion budget, when you break it down per student, we end up with about $11,000 per child. And I think that's so important to continue to elevate, because people don't really understand that. And you might hear $11,000 and think, oh, that's a ton of money. You can do so much with that. But when I consider area private schools who are thriving and doing well and preparing students for the next chapter of their lives, they're spending $30,000 per child. That is the kind of context that I want us to see public education in, worthy of that type of investment.
Yeah, that brings up Bob's favorite point, which is, we don't have enough money, and we don't have, this is sort of Nashville is sort of this low tax city in so many ways. But when people raise the property taxes, or, people get outraged. yet simultaneously they want public education to improve, but not necessarily have the will to, invest in it. What would you say to that? Like, what is your argument for, investing more dollars in public education?
So first I have to say one of my fatal character flaws is that I tend to be very passive aggressive, and it's something I've been working on, right? Like, don't get defensive, don't be rude, try to meet people where they are and understand the place they're coming from. So I think about my home. I'll be very vulnerable here. So I'll say I was 23 when I bought my home. I was only able to buy that because I'd worked for NASA, so I had a nice, it's like before I quit, I had a nice savings, but also because I was a bartender. I started teaching and was barely living off of that teaching salary, but having been a bartender allowed me to purchase a home. So as I'm teaching, I'm no longer bartending and I'm struggling. And my property taxes, I want to hold on to every penny. It's almost like I'm wanting to tell my mortgage company, like, hey, so can you just scale that back a little bit? I know the property tax is expensive, but so I get the community member that says, I don't have it to give. I can't even fathom paying the government more money. So I would ask them to instead view this as an investment. Look through the lens of children. Remember that they didn't ask to be here. They had no part in deciding what family they were born into, what state they live in, their gender, their ethnicity, nothing about them that they have a choice in. So it is up to us to make that investment in their futures. And so if it's worth the investment in my own child, if I want my own child to be confident and intelligent and be able to articulate his thoughts and feelings, then I should want that for everyone's child. And I think if we can make community members understand and or at least make them aware, sometimes they're just not aware of how much it costs to educate a child and all the different things that go into it. If we can build an awareness campaign, that might help squelch some of these conversations. The other thing is kind of humanizing data points. Stop talking about data as if it's some abstract thing that we don't have any way to wrap our arms around. If we say that 23% of our students come into kindergarten already one grade level behind, that means that 1 out of 4 babies, 1 out of 4 5-year-olds begins their career in education a grade level behind, already behind their peers. We need to invest in that. That doesn't mean that they had bad parents, and it doesn't mean that they'll have bad teachers that we need to compensate for. It means that this is a community issue that we haven't been able to solve for yet. So at the very least, where the community can insert themselves is in the public education system, is in resourcing that. So if I then tell you that that only 25% of our third graders read at grade level, that should also be a call to action for you. That should say that in the third grade, the first year that students start taking standardized tests, only 1 in 4 of our babies are on the path to reading at grade level, or on the trajectory to being college and career ready, so that they have their choice about their next steps in life. That should be a call to action for us to make the investment in them. And that should help us look at the 11th grade student that seems to be reading at a 7th grade level. That should force us, or at least encourage us, to see them with more empathy and to understand how had we made an investment literally 5 or 6 or 7 years later, how much different that child's life and how much different our society might be. Mm-hmm. I really don't know what else to say except to almost beg people to see children as worthy of love and investment. And I'm sorry to cut you off, Bob, but this is obviously something that's okay.
I almost cut you off. But I think what you're hitting on is a point that I had a discussion with a friend the other day, is that people are anti-government and anti-taxes because it's an easy target. But I think, one way to solve that, I started wondering, is like, government does so many things that people don't recognize. Like, why doesn't the government do commercials for what they do? Not just these, just say no commercials, the PSAs, but show what they're doing. So I'm going to put you on the spot and say, if you were going to do commercials from NPS, what are the images you show, and what do you want to project? What does MNPS really do?
Oh, this is so good. Okay, so I'm trying to think with the marketer's mind, and I don't have it, right? So first I'm going to say, I think you show a lot of children, but I also know that people we can become cynical when we see a lot of children, unfortunately. Instead of seeing it with the happy mind, or instead of that just putting us in a happy place so that we can receive information about them, we tend to be dismissive or think something is kiddie if it's laced with kids. So I would have showing children as they grow, and I would show children in different situations, even beyond demographic, even beyond gender and ethnicity. If I could show the same type of child. If it were a brown child from ages 1 to 10 to 15 to 20, or if I could very evenly compare experiences and how what happened in schools, like being able to have a paraprofessional to identify that a child has a need that hasn't been diagnosed yet. Having more of them around so that we can diagnose earlier rather than later, either physical or cognitive issues. If I could have persons or have trained professionals who could actually go into the community and help us find children who have slipped through the cracks. So like MNPS right now, in the middle of the deadliest pandemic in 100 years, we have some of our central office staff knocking doors all day long. I mean, literally walking to hotels to find our almost 2,000 students that we lost at some point, because not only did they have a devastating tornado back in March, but then we were a week later hit with this pandemic that hasn't really let up. So I would show what administrators, what that looks like in their day-to-day life, that they're not sitting at some desk watching TV. They are out knocking doors. We have principals from Overton High School, from Hume Fogg, from Hillsborough, from Whites Creek, who are going into our elementary schools when we have them open and sitting with students because we have quarantine days. So I would show the life, or a day in the life of an administrator who's, it's assumed, is making too much money and doing too little for students. I would try to look at what all the rumors have been over the last few years around why MNPS doesn't need funding, and try my best to show how they're not true, or try to at least sensitize us to what the need is for those different positions. Oh my gosh, I wish I was a marketer, because I'm sure there's a better answer to that. But
I wanted to show you as a teacher, and then showing you as a bartender at night to support your teaching.
Hey,
or I've got a friend who's a teacher and works in a grocery store at night. So it's
yes.
Yeah.
I do remember I would get off at 4:00 and I had to be at the bar by 4:30. So I worked all day. I was at Neely's Bend from 8 o'clock to 4:00, and then I had to be at the bar at 4:30. And then on a Friday night, this is Friday and Saturday night, so I'm there at 4:30, and I don't leave until 4:30 the next morning. So I ended up, so then I would wake up maybe 3:00 p.m. I would start my lesson plans, because I worked with the team teacher. So she would do the PowerPoint. I would do the actual weekly lesson plan or unit plan. I would start that on Saturday. I would get her PowerPoint, and then I would do it all again from about 4:30 to 4:30 on Saturday night, and then wake up Sunday and finish my lesson planning all week. It never stopped. And at this point, I had 2 master's degrees, but I was struggle busting just to make ends meet. Neither here nor there, but that is really an experience that many of our teachers have.
Hence the need for additional funding, so that teachers can actually make a wage that's complementary to the effort and the results that they put in.
Do you mind if I expound on that really quickly? I'll try to make it fast.
Sure.
I think sometimes when we think about more funding, people just seem to assume that, well, they just want to pay those teachers more. Well, there is a conversation to be had about teachers deserving and being in need of the funding that matches their skill level, the investment in students that we want them to make. But even beyond that, even if we didn't give teachers raises, we literally just need more teachers. We need to be able to provide pipelines for people to become teachers, pipelines for teachers to be able to become administrators and tutors, if you will, or coaches, so that they can help develop, new teachers, and so that we can retain teachers better, but also for all of the non-teachers that are still educators, because we've got to see our bus drivers, our cafeteria staff, our parapros, our counselors, our principals. We've got to see all those people as part of the thread of the education system, even though we don't directly label them as teachers. They're still in need of more capacity themselves, because the fact that we have nurses that have 300 and 400 and 500 students on their caseload, that's who you're responsible for in the middle of a pandemic, before and after. We need the capacity of the professional. We need the capacity of communications and marketing, because you're right. We should be able to make an investment in the community that says, hey, this is what we're doing. I know you haven't heard it before, but let me show it to you. Let me put it on the radio. Let me put it on the news. Let me put it on whatever TV station you watch, because I need you to understand what we're doing with this investment you're making in your kids.
Well, I think that's one reason our committee, one of our recommendations was that for MNPS to put together an aspirational budget. Yes. And one of the things we meant by that is we read statistics, something like, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but that national standards say that every school should have a nurse, and every social worker should have up to 250 kids. And all these different positions, what standards are there. And I have never seen a document that says, well, if we did just the national standard, just the base there, how much of that would really cost? On top of that, a few years ago, we had a citywide referendum, $1 billion for transportation. And I agree, transportation is needed. I don't doubt it. But I started to think, like, if our city is really willing to spend $1 billion, where was the discussion? Where would that money really be better put? And it's, I think it's interesting that the pandemic got us to fund one-to-one computers for every kid. Some kind of grant, national grant, got us to even think about transportation. But why can't we just think about this stuff in normal everyday life? Why can't we just say, hey, if some of our private schools are charging $35,000 a year for kids, and we're funding public schools at a third of that, something's wrong.
For sure.
Yeah. Christian, I want to go back to something that you touched on, but I want you to go deeper, because this is something that
Okay.
I've always talked about. What would happen? So there are a lot of people who decide to opt out of the public school system. Maybe they've heard something negative. Maybe they just automatically, inherently assume that the private school, is going to be different. What do you think, or how do you think schools would shift if more parents would just send their kids to their zone schools?
Where do we even start? So, I mean, part of it is that the community doesn't understand the way we fund schools, like individual schools. So you've been in the middle of it, so you've heard us talk about it a lot, but the everyday person doesn't know what a student-based budgeting system means. What we saw years ago was that if I just gave every single high school, no matter how many students they have, no matter what need they have, if I just gave them the same budget, it was so very inequitable, because you might have one school that had 1,000 students and one school that only had 900. How much different could it be? Could the experience be for the school that had a lower enrollment, for those students? Anyway, with the student-based budgeting, we try to make sure that not only do the dollars follow the child, but they're based on the needs of the child. And we have 3 big buckets. So we look at the socioeconomic status of the child's family, so what kind of background is the child coming from, which might be able to help us understand what resourcing they have in their neighborhood and in their home. So schools that are in lower income areas, we might want to focus heavily on before school, after school, and weekend programming, so that students aren't left at home by themselves. They don't become latchkey kids at young ages. Then we look at their the language. What language do they speak at home? If it's anything other than English, we need to be ready to offer them an ELL teacher or some kind of tutoring to make sure that they learn this language fluently. They can read and write in both languages. And then lastly, their ability level or ability. So there are students that are differently able, for whom we need not just ramps or paraprofessionals, but we need specific accommodations for speech or other issues that they might experience. So when we have schools that are in low income areas, there are traditionally all kinds of other issues we have to account for, like food deserts, like not having access to clean clothing or a washing machine. So that school needs to resource 1, 2, or several washing machines and dryers, so that not only families can wash their clothes, but that if the child has an accident or doesn't have clean clothes that day, they can be washed for them. We also need to make sure that we have counselors on staff for students that are in high need area or high need neighborhoods, because I'm privileged in that if I'm having a rough day, a rough week, or a rough month, like maybe people in the community don't like me because I went on vacation, I have access to a therapist. I can pay for that counseling for myself. My son and his father, we're not together right now. At some point, if my child needs counseling for that, even our co-parenting experience, we travel between states, I have the funding to resource that. Students in low income areas don't always have that. So we need to be able to provide that at the school level. So all of this, I feel like, is necessary to paint the picture for student-based budgeting, because many low income areas, everyone opts out of the school without even knowing the true reputation of the school. They know what they've heard from someone. They know they might have seen some kids hanging out on the steps before school, and they make a snap judgment. They don't realize all the great things happening inside. They don't recognize all the planning that goes into it. And they don't recognize that their own human capital, them as knowledgeable, savvy parents who are willing and able to be at the school to make sure the school is functioning at a high level, that them opting their child out pulls them out also, which is why it's so important for every community member to consider joining a PTO. Because if my parents opted out of Whites Creek. They opted for me to not attend Whites Creek. They instead wanted me to go to MLK, one of our area magnet schools. But that meant that Whites Creek no longer had access to all the fundraising that my parents did. They didn't have access to parents that were knowledgeable and understood what kind of questions to ask at parent nights. They didn't have access to my dad, who was always in my business when it came to basketball and would have been a bag boy if he could, just to make sure he saw me at every practice. It's like we lose those kind of basic supports, and we tend to diminish the importance of parents in public education. Just being there and being able to ask your child how their day was trickles into the rest of the school, because then your child goes to school happy. They know that they have a competent adult at home that is supporting them. They act as leaders in their school. They ask their friends how their day was the day before. That, it's like the experience is just totally different because of the parent involvement. So I know that was a roundabout way of saying, if parents are involved, even beyond having the extra dollars that come from their child being enrolled there, if they're just around and they know the questions to ask, the things to push for, the ways to advocate, it changes the experience of every child in that school.
Yep.
I mean, and we look at Lockland. I always talk about Lockland and Warner only because I know and love both principals and know that both are trying to work to the betterment of students. But historically, Lockland is busting at the seams. They have a wait list, but they are not the zone school. A half mile down the road, we have a school at half capacity. It is almost exclusively Black and brown. It is under-resourced. It is undervalued. The reputation is low. But baby, when I say that the children have grown 2 grade levels at that school because of what really matters is what's happening in the school, not what's being perceived to be happening.
Right. Yeah, the incredible principal over there I've gotten to know, yes. Ricky Gibbs. Yeah, he's amazing, and
he is.
He's amazing.
But he's also a reminder that we need to be able to develop pipelines for leaders like that. Imagine if instead of everyone rushing to Warner because they know that Ricky Gibbs is there, what if I knew that my principal was trained under Ricky Gibbs, that he's responsible for 10 principals. So now instead of everyone rushing to Warner, Warner's well taken care of, and 9 other schools are doing well because people know the stamp that Ricky Gibbs has put on the school.
Right.
But that's my selfish desire.
No, I think that's a great desire. We're going to be talking to someone about pipeline development soon. So I think that you are 100% accurate there. We've got about 2 more questions, and then
sure, I'll try to make them fast. I'm sorry.
We'll wrap up.
So are you going to be the good cop and ask the good question, or I'm going to ask the tough one? So are you going to ask a nice one?
Well, you asked a tough one.
All right, you ready?
Yep. I'm ready.
So the name of our Zoomcast is the City Report Card, and it came out of the Education Report. It used to be called the Education Report Card Committee, and we dropped the card to make it less of a critic committee, but more of an advocate committee. But here we are critiquing the city. So it's your turn as a former teacher to give our city a grade, the City Report Card, for how we deal with our children here in Nashville. How we support them, I should say, how we support our children in Nashville.
That's such a loaded question, but
yes,
I'll be that guy. I would give us a D+.
A D or B?
D as in dad. Yeah.
Okay. Give us a little bit of now the critique part.
Sure. So I would say, in my daytime job, I work for United Way of Greater Nashville. And so I get to see all the different partners that are looking to support Nashvillians, not just students, but cradle to grave. How are we looking to support children, support people? And I know that there are a lot of organizations out there fighting, but very often we work in silos. So I think that's a partnership issue. It's that we in the community do see a need. We want to tackle the need, but we don't have enough synergy. We don't have enough resources to be able to kind of amplify the good work that's happening. So we end up duplicating work, or we end up dropping work, or work just doesn't get funded. Planning doesn't get funded. We'll spend 2 years building a structure. It doesn't get funded. Then someone else finds funding for something similar. We go run there and spend, and it's just cyclical in that way. So we have partners that are ready, but we don't have enough partners and we don't have synergy. Then you have the city as a whole that continues to want better for their individual children. This is an every individual person in the city kind of problem versus a Nashville only problem. We tend to want better for our kids than we want for the kids next door or across the street. We want our kids to have a leg up. And please understand that I'm a parent, so I understand wanting to, you know, thinking that my son has to play the violin, he has to play the guitar, he has to play the trumpet, he has to play the, you know, he needs this, he needs that, he has to speak Mandarin and Spanish fluently, he needs to be reading sight words by the time he's 2. I get it, but I want all those things for everyone else's kid also. You know, I want my kid to be cuter than yours, but I want our kids to have the same experience, you know? And so part of it is that we as a city don't believe that. We really aren't invested in that. We think, well, for my child to have something good, I need to take something from someone else's child. And then you just have the governmental issues. You have the idea that we are a very separated and segregated city. So it means our representation is separated and segregated. I'll use my example for my district, for example. I have all the academic magnets, MLK, Hume Fogg, MEGS. I also have charter schools. I have Nashville Classical, Explore, KIP, and LEAD. I have zone schools, Pearl Cone, Stratford, Warner. I have optional schools, Lockland and Camp. You know, I have all these different types of schools. And so I see the different perspectives, but mine is very rare. Most of our districts are very homogenous. Bellevue is really homogenous. Antioch, in that every school is extremely diverse, is homogenous in that way. District 1, in that it's Whites Creek in the Bordeaux area. So it's almost, you know, it's homogenous in that it's fairly African-American. So we don't always have the representation at the city level and even sometimes at the school board level to really advocate in equitable ways. So sometimes you have the haves getting way more than the have-nots used to get. And so that adds to the resourcing. And then I'll be honest, anytime I see a bike lane, even though I do ride bikes and I run, you know, I run outdoors, I get frustrated because I think about how the $6,000 for that bike lane to go from this city block to the next city block, how much that could have done for a child. How that could have at least given an entire classroom a set of books for every class that they take. So, you know, I just think about all the resourcing or how much we could have prioritized children when we made that part, or when we developed that part of the budget. That's a selfish, I hate to call out the bikers, but that's my selfish thing. So I would give us a D+. Last year, 2 years ago, I would have given us an F. I think we've made strides in that we at least have partners wanting to come to us. We are now finally a 1-to-1 district, you know, and I don't want to leave us in a space that says there's no hope. So we're, you know, D+. If we keep being good, maybe a C-, but.
Well, on that note, this is the last question I'll ask. So you said that we've made strides. Last year we made an F. This year we're at a D+. So we're on the move. Is there anything that we are doing at this moment, maybe something that has caused, you know, that we did as a result of the pandemic, that we should carry forward post-pandemic? Is there something amazing that has happened caused by the pandemic that we should keep after this is all closed?
The airing of grievances. And that can be really, really frustrating. It can be hard to hear if you're in a leadership position, especially when the world seems a lot quicker to assign negative intent than positive intent. So that can be frustrating, but it's also good for us to hear because it just keeps people engaged. So once you've aired your grievance and you said it in the darndest way you can, I can at the very least use that as a moment to engage you in a deeper way. So I can follow up with you and tell you how we're either planning to address that problem or how we've addressed it in a small scale way, and then ask you for suggestions or ask you for partnerships. So I think just the airing of grievances, and I do think when we air grievances, it also tends to elevate leadership, because those who can continue to kind of deal with that, who can respond in positive, thoughtful, engaging ways, will be seen as leaders that we tend to follow. And that means that we'll follow their information also. So gone are the days when we just have politicians who will just spit non-facts and misinformation, or not be there to roll up their sleeves with the community. We've got to be more focused on elevating them when we air our grievances. So Karenism has a silver lining. I know that's such a sidebar way, but yeah, Karenism.
No, I really respect that you said that. I appreciate that. You're so pure of heart. I appreciate that.
Don't give me too much credit. I mean, you know, I get frustrated and I throw my phone sometimes, but it's like I needed to see it. So, okay, here you go. Thank you. Just being vulnerable and honest, you know, but yes.
I really appreciate everything, your time and your honesty and openness, and for you serving the position you are. I know it's not easy, and you get a lot of targets on your back, but I appreciate it's good work.
No, I appreciate that. And I will say, as cliche as it sounds, it really does help when I hear that other people not only support me and support our schools, but that they're ready to be part of it also. And the fact that both of you were on the report card committee for 3 years, right?
Yes.
Don't say report card
I'm sorry,
anymore. It's just report
the
committee.
Chamber Education Report Committee.
There we go.
That was my bad.
Change the name.
But see, I appreciate that, and being able to remember that in my dark moments, like, look, people are mad right now. I need to give them their space to be frustrated, but there are so many more people, rallying behind and fighting for schools. It helps keep me sane. So just thank you all for the platform and for having our students' backs.
Well, I think there's a movement out. There's a movement waiting to happen out there. I just think there needs to be a leader and a parade, and we'll all jump behind. So I think there's a movement to support kids and support schools.
Thank
I
you.
agree. I agree.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Christian. We have gained so much from you today. We appreciate your time. And thank you, viewers, for tuning into this week's episode of the City Report. See you next week. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.